Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys about something that is a bit of a misconception, or it's something that gets said oftentimes, but the way it's said isn't really what is meant. And it creates confusion for people, and that's that pecs don't really matter for bench press and your quads don't matter for the squat. Right? You see that in certain powerlifting circles, and part of that gets pushed because of equipped powerlifting potentially de-emphasizing the importance of those muscles a bit. But you also see in a lot of raw powerlifting a lot of very, very successful champions who don't put any extra work into their quads, and a lot who don't put anything into their pecs, and yet they still hit elite numbers, which creates a lot of confusion. Because when we think about it, we think of the quads, and rightly so, as being a primary mover in the squat. Because we look at the knee flexion involved, right? Look at the bending of the knee and then the extension of the knee. Right? You have to use the quads to squat. You have to. It's impossible to remove the quads as a primary mover. Same thing on the bench press. The pecs will always be the primary mover. So it kind of comes to that point of why do some guys not focus on it? And what it comes down to is that if they are not true weak links for you and you're not built a certain way, putting extra effort into them will be a misallocation of resources. And that's the interesting thing when it comes to building big lifts, is understanding that we all have different levers, we all have different techniques, and so what ends up happening is that wasting a lot of time on a muscle group that's already being hit sufficiently to get you to the strength level that you need off of all your normal training, and not addressing the things that might need more work for you will create a problem. And for a lot of guys, the pecs are just not really their limiting factor on the bench press, because they already do lots of benching and chest pressing. And they're not particularly pec dominant benchers. Now, there are exceptions. We see some guys out there, and I think it's at least one guy, and I can't remember, UP something powerlifter. Perfect example of a guy who doesn't do anything but bench, has no legs, weighs like 150 something pounds with this massive bench press. This bench is 400 plus. But you notice that his chest is absolutely enormous. Not his rib cage, his pecs. The guy has monstrous pecs. He has the pecs of a 250 pound lifter on a 150 pound body. And accordingly, he has a massive bench press. In the case of someone like that, who is a very, very pec dominant bencher, all he has really had to do is build massive chest. And his bench is monstrous. Now, he can't do anything else, but he can bench press. The difference is that for a lot of people, if we're more arm dominant or anything else, is that the triceps become a bigger issue. And more importantly, what I think a lot of people forget, and we'll get to the squat in a minute, is with the bench, the pecs are a primary mover, always on the bench. So if you're doing lots of bench pressing, your pecs are getting a lot of stimulation. What isn't getting stimulation are the secondary muscles that may be your limits. All right, how about your upper back? We know that a well-developed upper back can add a lot of pounds to your bench press because it gives you stability. Right, it's the opposing joint. Right, it's the opposing muscle group. We need it for stability. People talk about stabilizers. That's a stabilizer for your bench press, your whole upper back. Rear delts, mid traps, rhomboids, all that. The ability to hold in tight up there and drive that through the bench. Have a stable platform. Okay? And it helps you stay tight to get spring out of the bottom. All right, your upper back matters. It doesn't get trained at all on the bench. So for a lot of people, if their pecs are already getting, let's say, close to their maximum recoverable volume, or at least their minimum effective volume, just from their max benching, their speed benching, their volume benching, whatever training protocol you use, you're probably doing a decent amount of bench press work. Well, the pecs are a primary mover. They are the most important muscle in the bench. They're getting stimulated. They're growing. Those stabilizers are not getting the direct work they need for hypertrophy. Then we come over to something like the triceps. All right. We know that frequently the triceps can be a limiting factor in the bench, but they don't get the best stimulus in the world on the bench. Again, we know based on EMG data and other stuff that once you're outside the novice phase, the triceps get worked on the bench press, but not always particularly well. Not maximum growth. In other words, if you did your minimum effective volume, or even a couple sets over for your pecs on the bench press, you might not be at your minimum effective volume for the triceps once you're no longer a novice. Okay? And if your triceps are weak, it will limit your maxes. You might do just fine at volume work. Right? Your 5 rep max or 8 rep max might be just fine. But when you go to hit a 1 rep max, your triceps can be a weak link. You miss maxes. And if you had just put a lot of time into building those triceps up bigger and stronger, your max might go up 30 or 40 pounds with the same size chest. Okay? So in that case, the tricep work would be more warranted. Now, for other people, depending on how they're built and how they're developed, extra pec work might actually be warranted. And that's the whole point. That's the whole point. But no one is ever going to be weaker on their bench for building big triceps, because it is frequently a weak link when we think in terms of what gets worked correctly from a training volume perspective. If you're doing nothing but benching, you might find that your triceps do become the weak link on your bench, in which case you really should be doing a lot of tricep work. In my case, that matters. I need more tricep. It's limiting my bench. So what about when we come over to the squat? You will see large amounts of powerlifters who don't necessarily do extra quad work. I go long periods of time without doing any quad work, and yet my quads are monstrously big. See me doing all this posterior chain work most of the time. Not saying I don't do some phases of a little bit of quad work. I do. But it's not necessary. I can build big quads just from my squatting and deadlifting. Because that's what people forget too. Depending on what style of deadlift you do, particularly if you do speed pulls, sumo, and things like that, you do a lot of deficit deadlifts, your quads get a lot of hypertrophy stimulation. And in fact, you might very quickly find that your quads reach their minimum effective volume and even their ideal effective volume, their maximum effective volume, before you do any quad exercises. Again, particularly if you do deep speed work, you do speed pulls with sumo or deficit deadlift, or just the high volumes of either of the latter two thrown into all your squatting, your quads might be about as big as they're going to get. Here's the other thing. Depends on the style of squat that you do. If you're doing all of that and your quads are growing, but you're choosing to use a wider stance on the squat to where the quads work just as hard, but other muscles come into play even more, things like your hips, your glutes, your erectors, that could all start limiting your squat. Because if your quads are strong enough to lift a certain amount of weight and you just change your stance and go really wide, your squat might go up 50 pounds with the same quad strength, if the other muscles can keep up. Well, when we think about this, what else do we need? What happens when we go to a wider stance squat? We have to stay more upright. Well, to stay more upright with a 1 rep max, we might need a stronger upper back. All right, if we're going to go with a wider stance and our quads are already really well developed, what's going to be our limiting factor? Our hips, our glutes, some cases maybe even hamstrings, because what can we use hamstrings for? If you get big enough hamstrings, particularly if you got big calves, you can bounce off your hamstrings at the bottom of a squat. Just like we talk about the bicep, if it gets big enough, can bounce you out of the bottom of a bench because it's like a spring that you can hit. All right, if your hamstrings get really big, you can bounce off of them. You can bounce off of them out of the bottom and push you through your sticking point. And then your hips and everything can engage, because once you hit that sticking point, if you can drive the knees out, get the external rotation of the hips, what happens? You'll drive through. Okay? Hamstrings can start to matter real quickly at that point. Not because they're necessarily a primary mover, even though they're very much a dynamic stabilizer, they do matter. The actual physical size of them can sometimes help you bounce off your calves. That matters. But at a certain threshold, with again the wider stance, which is again what most people, if they have the muscle to support it correctly, the wider stance usually has a higher 1 rep max. Sometimes as much as 10%. Your hips, your glutes, your hamstrings, your upper back could all start to become a limiting factor on your squat. Which means if you're wasting a bunch of time on your quads, it may not be the best use of your resources. And it's not because the quads aren't still a primary mover. It's that the other muscles can become a weak link. and they're going to contribute more past a certain threshold. Particularly if your training itself, your primary exercises already blow your quads up big. So that's really what's going on here. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.